minute. So first of all, let me welcome everyone here. I'm Nancy Aries. I'm the interim dean of the Marxe School. I'm delighted to welcome you today to what will be the last Marxe talk of this year that we entitled Title IX, Unentitled 9. This month is, you probably know, is the 50th anniversary of the passage of Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972. And I can't think of two better persons to discuss Title IX than Jay Berman, a Baruch alum who was a basketball player and trustee of the Baruch College Fund, as well as a member of the Marxe School Advisory Board, and Professor Sonia Jarvis, distinguished lecturer at the Marxe School. I met Jay a year ago upon being appointed interim dean of the school, and we talked about his work as chief of staff for Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana in the 1970s. That day, Jay shared with me that in his career, he was most proud of drafting the Title IX legislation and overseeing its passage. And he'll be featured later this month in a 4-part ESPN documentary about Title IX. So accompanying Jay is Sonia Jarvis, who this winter she shared with me an article posted on Stanford University's athletic page, telling how 2 years after the passage of Title IX, Sonia, the first Black female varsity athlete at Stanford, and 2 teammates advocated weekly at the director of athletics office for the women's team to be treated the same as the men's, from access to a full-size gym, so they weren't hitting the wall every time they ran down court and made a basket, to professional coaches, to training equipment, uniforms, and scholarships. So I thought, really, how great to bring together someone who was instrumental in drafting Title IX legislation and someone who 2 years later was able to change women's athletics at Stanford University on account of the law. And that they'd be in a position to talk about what the law was intended for, its unintended consequences, and what we're facing, in the 50 years since this all happened. So let me just give you a little more background. I'm not going to go into depth in their bios. They'll be posted on the web. But Jay has a master's in history and government from Northwestern and completed work on his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh before accepting the position in Senator Bayh's office. As staff director of the Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments and Bayh's chief of staff, he worked on both the 25th and 26th amendments to the Constitution, the passage of Title IX, the Copyright Act of 1976, and he proudly had written the defeat of 2 Nixon nominees for the Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Berman became vice president of public policy for Warner Communications and then president and CEO, and later chairman of the Recording Industry Association of America, where he was responsible for negotiating the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and for provisions to protect American intellectual property rights abroad. He also helped create the Sound Exchange, and in 1999 worked for President Clinton as special counsel for trade, then moving to London to become chairman and CEO of IFPI, representing the record companies worldwide. Being on the panel today is Professor Sonia Jarvis, a distinguished lecturer at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. Her scholarship and teaching focuses on race, politics, and the media. She's currently completing a book entitled Through a Prism Darkly, the Media's Impact on Race and Politics in America Since the Civil Rights Act of '64. She's co-author of a book entitled State of Confusion, The Crisis of Voter Identification and What to Do About It, which will be published by New York University Press. Professor Jarvis went to Yale School of Law and then clerked under the U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr., who made landmark civil rights rulings that helped end segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South. And for 6 more years, Jarvis served as the executive director of the National Coalition on Black Voter Participation. She's a frequent commentator on public issues and has been interviewed by major media outlets, including NPR, The Washington Post, and CNN. We're also honored to have with us today Professor Kenneth Shropshire, who will moderate the discussion, and he too is a Title IX expert. Professor Shropshire is ending a 5-year stint as founder and CEO of the Global Sport Institute, and he's Adidas Distinguished Professor of Global Sports at Arizona State University. He'll return to the University of Pennsylvania this summer, where he spent 35 years at the Wharton School to become senior advisor to the dean and the David W. Houck Professor Emeritus. While at Wharton, Shropshire was director of the Wharton Sports Business Initiative, professor of Africana Studies, and academic director of Wharton sports-focused executive education programs. He graduated from Stanford with a degree in economics. He received his JD from Columbia Law School. Professor Shropshire has worked with professional leagues as well as professional athletes. His 12 books, podcasts, and other media cover issues such as stadium and arena construction, sponsorship valuation, and DEI. So before we begin, I just want to review the Zoom protocol for the session. Professor Shropshire will moderate the discussion with Jay Berman and Professor Sonia Jarvis for the next hour or so. But at the same time, Professor Tiffany Lewis will be assisting with the Q&A. She'll be moderating our chat. Professor Lewis is also an expert in the field of women's rights, and her book, Uprising, How Women Use the U.S. West to Win the Right to Vote, received the National Communication Association's award for Best Book in Argumentation and Forensics. It's an amazing group. So we'll leave the cameras on, but your audio will be off, so please enter questions into Zoom. Before we start, I'm sorry, I'm going on and we need to begin. I'd like to recognize in the audience some special people, supporters, some special people whose support for this school is just essential. Austin Marxe, the school's benefactor, is here with us today, and several members of the Baruch College Fund, including Max Berger, Michael Lewin, the chair of the Marxe School Advisory Board, including members of the Baruch College, not the Baruch, the Marxe School Advisory Board, and in addition with Yoshimi Muto and Louis Friedman. In addition, in our Zoom room is Catherine Bayh, Senator Bayh's widow. So welcome to all of you. Welcome, Catherine. So I'd also like to thank Diana Lassoff, Andrea Hundley, Jonathan Alcor for assisting with the organization of the event. So now let me turn this over to Dr. Shropshire. The e-podium is yours.
Thank you, Dean Aries. And I could not be happier than to be here right now to have this conversation in this moment on an anniversary that we've all been kind of knowing was going to come up, but here it is. And one more preamble, and then I'm going to get right to Jay with the first question, like how did this all come about? But everybody needs to know that I was at Stanford the same time that Sonia was there and witnessed this whole thing, including the ramshackle gym and all the activities that she'll talk about. But more importantly, sorry, Sonia, my wife may have been the second varsity athlete. She was a tennis player. She ended up being an AIAW, the precursor to the NC2A champion in doubles for a couple of years. Diane Morrison was her name. And then my daughter, I don't know, decades later, ended up at Stanford and ended up playing varsity squash, which would not have taken place but for Title IX. So I am a emphatic supporter of everything that Title IX does positively. We'll talk about some of the negatives as well, but the positives have been great for my family and for my life. So I'm delighted to be here and have this conversation. And I'm the moderator, ringmaster, referee. Won't be saying a whole lot, but just trying to keep the conversation rolling. So Jay, I mean, you were the guy, you know, as I say, in the room. Kind of let's get our
tell that to Luis Manuel Miranda.
Yeah, our Manuel Miranda kind of moment. Just tell us about it. I mean, I know it's the worst way to ask a question, but just tell us.
Okay, I'll start. So at least in my mind, this Zoom is a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And again, if I look back over those 50 years, to see how much progress has been made, that gives me reason to celebrate. I believe it's had extraordinarily positive impact on American society, probably second only to the civil rights bills of the 1960s in its transformative nature. So my role here today, I think, is a little history lesson, tell you about the why it happened and how it happened, and to set the stage for one of the most famous basketball players in an illustrious Stanford history, Professor Jarvis, to tell you a little bit about how it actually impacted somebody. But before I start, I want to take this opportunity to just give you some observations of my own, and in effect, what I think of as trying to set the record straight about Title IX. And I want you to keep in mind that these are my own views, my own recollections of a 84-year-old man about something that happened 50 years ago. But I lived with this every year after those 50 years because it turned out to be so incredibly significant and important. And I imbued its importance on my children and my grandchildren. And to say, I was an extraordinarily lucky guy who served as a legislative assistant to the author of Title IX, Birch Bayh. I was lucky. I worked for a great guy who did great things, and some of which I would include the author of the 25th Amendment, the author of the 26th Amendment, guy who led the defeat of two horrible Nixon nominees to the Supreme Court of the United States, the guy responsible for keeping out of the Constitution prayer in the public schools, and what was then an abortion amendment to the Constitution. And the interesting thing about that legislative career, for all those incredible things that he did, in his own mind, Title IX was his greatest legacy. And so I've come to appreciate it more and more myself.
And Jay, how did he's doing all this other stuff. When did was the idea for Title IX his? I mean, how did
so Title IX, it was inextricably tied to his authorship of the Equal Rights Amendment. And all of that grew out of a very personal experience, which was not his, but was Marvella Bayh, her experience as an extraordinary high school student in Oklahoma, whose dream it was to go to the University of Virginia. She applied to the University of Virginia, and I believe it was in 1951, and she wasn't accepted. And in her explanation of what she drilled into Senator Bayh's mind day after day and year after year about how women were discriminated against, she was told women need not apply. That was the phrase, women need not apply. And he kept that both in his mind and in his heart, which led him to the idea of the Equal Rights Amendment. At the same time that we were trying to move the Equal Rights Amendment in the Senate Judiciary Committee, we're being blocked by Sam Ervin, a senator from North Carolina, who, operating with Jim Eastland, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, kept us from getting a vote. And in those days,
I'm sorry, give us a time frame. What year?
This is in 1970, 71.
Okay.
And in those days, the chairman had absolute and total control. There was nothing we could do to stop Ervin from filibustering in the committee as long as Eastland gave him the power to do that. And what happened then, coincidentally, in the same time frame, a woman named Bunny Sandler applied for a job. She was a graduate of the University of Maryland. She applied for a faculty job at Maryland. And Bunny Sandler was told, and this is the quote, that she didn't get the job because she came on too strong. That was the reason. Now, if you just want to take a minute and reflect on what did it mean that she came on too strong? It was a woman who wanted the job. She didn't get the job because she was a woman. And what Bunny Sandler did was to take this one incident and turn it into a crusade in which she went around and found literally hundreds of women who had exactly the same kind of experience. They had been denied opportunities, either for jobs or for advancement, for one reason and one reason only: they were women. She took this body of information to Congresswoman Edith Green of Oregon, who was a very senior and well-respected member of the House Education Committee. And Edith Green turned this information into a hearing of monumental proportions. She hired Bunny Sandler. Bunny Sandler produced volumes of incidents where women had been denied admissions to school, professorships, all within an academic setting. That led Mrs. Green to think about, given her chairmanship of a subcommittee in the House Education Committee, about what to do about it. Now, Bunny Sandler and Birch Bayh, coincidentally, served on the executive board of a women's organization known as WEAL, Women's Equity Action League. And it was almost a precursor to the women's movements of the late 60s and 70s. And they came to talk about this stuff. And it put Edith Green and Birch Bayh together. And when Birch Bayh found that it was impossible to move the Equal Rights Amendment, he saw the opportunity to take advantage of what Bunny Sandler and Edith Green had uncovered. And what he did was, while the Education Amendment Bill was on the floor of the Senate, he asked Jay Berman and my colleague PJ Mode to take over this thing of 37 words, patterned after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to take it to Senator Claiborne Pell's staff on that committee and tell them that we wanted to offer this as an amendment. And this is exactly what PJ and I did. We were not welcomed. We were told not to offer the amendment because this bill, which was proposing Pell Grants for the first time, also included the incredibly volatile issue of school busing. And you can only imagine, for those of us old enough to recall what the 1970s were like and what the issue of school busing meant politically. So it was the heart of what was going on in the debate in the Senate. And it was so important that it was one of the few times that I can remember in my 12 years working for Senator Bayh that there was a bill on the floor under a closed rule. That's what busing did to this bill, so that any amendment had to be particularly relevant to what was going on.
Jay, let me ask you this: 37 words, and that's always been something that's fascinated me. And I counted those words, and yes, 37.
I counted them again myself.
Yeah. Did they remain the same? And it's fascinating to think about. Title IX is just 37 words. I mean, did they remain the same throughout this process, or did they?
They did. What changed over time was what followed the 37 words. Right. And even before the promulgation of the regulations, there were debates about those 37 words that clarified what they meant. So the first debate, well, first of all, let me just go back for 1 second, because in 1971, when he first did this under the closed rule, Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, realizing that it was a closed rule and realizing that he didn't like Title IX, made a parliamentary motion asking the Senate, parliamentarian of the Senate, to advise the chair that this language was non-germane to the Education Act. Now, could you imagine that those 37 words, which were intended to impact education, were non-germane? And the parliamentarian ruled they were non-germane because the word sex never appeared in the Education Act amendments. It was mind-boggling. But we lost that battle, but we didn't lose the war, because Senator Bayh came right back in the second session of that Congress. The Education Act amendments hadn't passed, And we offered it again on the floor under an open rule, and it did pass. And it passed in the House under the leadership of Edith Green. She was responsible for putting Title IX in the Education Act amendments in the House.
And Jay, I want to come back to some more on the passage of the bill and the like in a moment, but I want to go to Sonia just for a moment. And Sonia, I don't want you to talk about the Stanford experience yet. I want to make sure everybody hears what it was like to be a girl playing basketball prior to 1971. And what was your sports life all about in the 60s, early 70s? And we'll get you off mute there.
See, I had to keep it muted so I didn't interrupt Jay. No, all good stuff, all good stuff. It was a funny time for girls' sports because some places didn't know what to do with us as active sports people. So in basketball, before I got to Stanford, we were still playing 6-on-6, 3 guards, 3 forwards. I'll just leave it there. I don't want to talk anymore about that. I was lucky at the school I graduated from in that.
And where was that?
This was Bowie Senior High School in Maryland. Okay. We were stationed at the Fort Meade Army Base, and the school normally handled 1,000 students, but because of busing that Jay mentioned, we had 3,000 students. So we had 3 shifts. And the good part about the shifts is there were sports all day. It started at 6, went till 6. So let's do another sport. So in addition to basketball, which I was interested in, but I didn't like the 3-on-3 because I had brothers and they told me you play with 5. Beyond that, it was volleyball, it was tennis, it was track and field hockey. Those were my sports.
And relative to the boys, maybe that'll be more telling. What did you see? What do you remember?
I remembered that the boys had better facilities. They had balls that weren't flat. They were encouraged and treated as rock stars. I mean, who doesn't like that? I mean, I also played music, so I understood rock stars, but the boys really had that going on in a way that made me say, why can't we do better? And that was high school. I wasn't even thinking about law school yet, but it was just noticing the difference in treatment. And the only area where that was not true was track and field, where it was all about the numbers. What are your results, right? And so that felt more even than any of the other sports. So that's what I came to Stanford with. Not sure how I was going to get there, whether it was going to be through sports or music or academics, and it ended up being academics.
Yeah, and I'll add, other than, as Sonia says, women running in the Olympics, everything else was just a novelty. I mean, I don't mean that any way other than literally. And when I got to Stanford, this whole idea of women playing, field hockey and sort of some other sports where things were happening a little bit more. It just didn't exist in the LA Unified School District where I was. Just was completely non-existent in that period of time. And nobody really thought it was problematic. It wasn't this major issue. It was just, that's the girls' gym over there, which was smaller. We actually had a girls' gym, which was smaller. Or this is, the girls get this time, a little less time, but the girls get some time to do this or that. So Jay, before we get to Sonia's Stanford experience, finish up. So it passed, the bill passes.
So the bill, this is a truly ironic set of circumstances. So the bill is being debated in the Senate. Senator Bayh is the floor leader trying to get this amendment added to the Education Act. And behind the scenes, we're still trying to move the Equal Rights Amendment. And we end up just at about that time being able to make a deal with the chairman, with Jim Eastland. I won't go into the details because it's not a pretty picture. He wanted something. We were blocking it. We said, okay, only on the condition that you give us a chance to report out equal rights, which we knew if we had the chance would pass. We had already canvassed the committee. And Birchbuy's on the floor leading the debate on Title IX. He gets a call from Jim Eastland that says, you can have a meeting in Senator Mansfield's room. Senator Mansfield was the majority leader of the Senate, and he had a room right off the floor of the Senate. And he said, you could have a Judiciary Committee meeting in there and you can report out ERA. And Birchbuy went to his friend, Ed Brooke, a Republican senator from Massachusetts, and said, Ed, would you take the floor with this for a while? I've got to go and deal with the Equal Rights Amendment. Went in, passed out the Equal Rights Amendment, came back and passed out Title IX. It was a great day. It was a great day for the good guys.
Wow.
So that brings me to the next step, and something that I also want to take a moment to clarify, because every time I read this in an article on Title IX, I wince. It said that President Nixon signed Title IX into law on June 23rd, 1972. Well, President Nixon did indeed sign a bill on June 23rd, 1972. It was the Education Act amendments of 1972, which included Title IX, and I'm prepared to make a bet of whatever amount that he had no idea that it was in there. And the reason I say that is that in the presidential signing message, there is not a single word, not a mention of Title IX. It's all about busing. So President Nixon deserves no credit for Title IX. The credit in terms of Republicans go to President Gerald Ford and Secretary of Education Caspar Weinberger, who developed the regulations to implement Title IX, which was an incredibly essential step because those 37 words were specifically designed to be as broad as possible and not specific. And so the regulations had to fill that gap. And Secretary Weinberger took on that task. There were 9,600 public comments regarding the drafting of the regulations. Almost all of them had to do with sports, and almost all of them had to do with the fact that girls should not be getting athletic scholarships because it would adversely affect football and basketball for men.
And let's stop at that, because I do want to spend some time on the whole football issue and Senator Tower and all
Yes.
that. But let's now let us hear Sonia, your story as you do get to Stanford, which certainly wasn't a rosy beginning sports wise, but tell us what it was all about. As I came in with a football scholarship and had housing and training table and everything was in place, and I'm a third string, not very good offensive lineman. My sports life was wonderful. But Sonia, go right ahead.
Well, it was the idea wasn't so much that the girls were all ready to protest. It was much more just asking some basic questions like, well, can we have soccer or some other sport? It wasn't the tough ones like basketball. And at that point, the school really didn't know what it was doing. I'll be fair to Stanford on that, in the sense of, okay, we're letting all these girls into school now. What do we do with them? And we could have just sat there waiting for them to figure it out, but instead we started asking questions, and I started the question when it sounded like they weren't paying any attention to us. Why can't we play in the same brand new gym that the boys are playing in? Hello? We were still in the baby gym, where if you lost your sense of place, you would run into the wall because there was no room beyond the basket. You literally ran into the wall. So if you were doing a fast break, you needed to look up, otherwise you were going to break something hitting that wall. And so that's really where it started. I just started asking, well, can we play in the big gym? And I started asking, well, who can answer this question? The athletic director.
So can I ask one question?
Sure.
As I'm going through my memory banks, was it the Robley gym that was?
It was the Robley gym.
And so let me give a little more color to it. This gym was literally in the middle of nowhere. Anybody from Stanford, on Stanford's campus, it was, and I'm not. This is not an exaggeration. It was at least a mile from the primary gym where the men played, and basically all the athletic facilities. This gym today, and I think it has been converted into like, is, for intramural, to have fun, but not for serious varsity athletics. I just wanted to give a little more perspective on where it was. I mean, I hated to play in there. I was not a very good basketball player either. You may wonder what kind of, the athletic genes clearly came from my wife to my daughter and son, but that's a whole nother story. But it was just not a great facility. So.
It was not nice on any level. And so I just started asking, well, who can answer the question? And nobody seemed to know, because wait a second, we didn't even have coaches yet, folks. We were doing this on our own, organizing teams, and not just with basketball, with the other sports as well. Actual coaches being paid real money didn't happen for another 2 years in terms of Stanford. And once they got it, they did pretty well with it, but it took them a while to get to that. And so we, when I say we, I'm talking about my roommate, Jasmine Gunthorpe, Stephanie Colbert, and Mariah Burton Nelson. The four of us basically put together a tag team that one of us would be in the office asking these questions on a regular weekly basis, just over and over. Who can answer this question? Who can make the decision? How do we get into the big gym? And it was all about the big gym. Now, when we finally got into the big gym, we only had 20 people show up, but that's another story, okay? And that's why when I see the Stanford women's team play today and the gym is full, I can't express to you how excited that makes me, knowing where we started with only our best friends showing up and rooting us on, all right? And
now I want to say something about somebody else's experience, which is a lot more colorful than yours.
Okay.
And every time I read about it, I both chuckle and have great admiration. And this is the story of the Yale women's crew. Yale had for many,
I know that story
years,
too, Jay. Go ahead.
Yale for many, many years had great men's crews. And then they fell on hard times. And they did have a women's crew. The interesting thing about the women's crew is they had no place to shower and no place to change. So these women who were in the water, got out of the water, had to put on their clothes and go to school. And they decided, the way Sonia and her roommates decided, to take this to the authorities. And they went to the athletic director for women's athletics at Yale, whatever that meant. But before they went there, they called the press, and they had the press cover their meeting with the director of athletics. They met in her office, topless, with their backs to the camera.
Okay.
And on their backs, they had printed Title IX. This story was covered by the New York Daily News and the New York Times. Need I say that thereafter, Yale provided a locker room and showers for its women's crew. And the pictures are unbelievable.
Well, we'll save those for another time. Thank you for that.
Sonia, I want to know, as you get ready to answer, and I can't help keep reflecting on this, and I never asked you this. Did you know what you were doing at the time, and how much of it was you were doing something bigger, and how much was it we just want to play in the big gym?
Well, I can honestly say the motivating force was we just want to play. That's where we started with it. And when we kept being not ignored, I won't say that, I will just say dismissed. It was, what do we do now? And that's when I started reading and I said, well, there's this new law that just passed. And why don't we talk to the coach and the athletic director about what this new law means for our school? That's where it started. That's when we started hounding them, because they didn't want to sit down and talk to us, among other things. But they also hadn't figured out, well, we don't have a full-time coach. We had someone who was a volunteer initially. And that means we've got to change our budget. And, you know, the things that administrators worry about. I know they were thinking about that. Whereas we were just asking over and over, can we play ball in the big gym and ultimately get to the point where we have the same opportunities to play that the boys do? That's where we started.
Right.
And I was the one who kept coming back to, there is this law called Title IX. And I think
the not yet lawyer, the lawyer to be.
I was not yet a lawyer, but there was this law, and why aren't we following this law at the very least? That's really what was behind the motivation, along with just wanting to play and have our friends be able to see us and not risk injury every time we played. That's it. And then when I got to Yale, they were better a little, Jay, because the girls there had started that process. But I ended up playing basketball with the boys because they didn't have a girls team at Yale Law School. But that's another story for another day. Okay.
And Jay, I want to get you a minute, but I just want to, for young people out here, just one more add to that. You never know where things are going to go. Man, now there's so many NCAA championships for women at Stanford, so many Olympians from Stanford growing out of this. And I'll tell you, just small story, not as important as that. The football team at the time did not have a black coach. We only had 8 black players on the team, and we had a mini protest saying we need a black coach. And they ended up hiring a guy whose name was Willie Shaw. This is 19.
He played for the Packers. He was a defensive back.
And Willie is, I mean, who knows how things end up. His son, David Shaw, is now the head coach at Stanford. So these things that never would have happened if some kind of stepping up didn't occur. It just happens over. And you think it's a small thing in the moment. It's really, we wanted a black coach. We weren't trying to change the world. We want to play in the gym. It's those small steps that can be so important. Yeah.
Well, and then when we look back at last year's NCAA tournament, we see that the girls were still not being treated as the boys were when it came to the Final Four and the rest. I mean, the facilities, but also the exposure,
right,
and all that follows. And so it's another indication that we have not completed this mission.
No, it was 49 years before the NCAA permitted the women to use the phrase March Madness.
Yeah, well, why did that take so long, Jay?
Why did it take so long?
Right, because we were not considered on the same level.
Same level, exactly.
And that becomes part of the mission forward, especially during a time period when women's rights, period, are under threat. But I promised I wasn't going to go off on that today, only because we're waiting for a decision within the next 10 days. But in the meantime, it's this question of how best do we preserve what is positive about Title IX going forward? And how does that relate to the bigger question of what's going on with the ERA? And its current, it's stalled in the Congress because our Congress can't pass anything right now unless you have 60 votes in the Senate. So we've got a lot of different challenges that are still ahead of us, but it's how to continue organizing even if you're not having immediate success. And I would argue that that's something we learned in our battle with our school over just access to the gym. And the other things came later, having a full-time coach who's now one of the most celebrated female coaches in the country. Hello. And how from that we can learn that even if you don't win that first battle, it doesn't mean you stop waging the war to make meaningful change. So that's one of the lessons that I would share with this group and others.
And I think that's why I specifically wanted it to be known as Title IX, not entitled 9. It's been a struggle. Everything after enactment took effort to get.
Well, Jay, on that note, as I said, I want to talk about the football issue. Talk about how much of the world wanted and still wants, let's just be honest, football to be viewed in this context of equality, and Senator Tower and kind of the other things that happened at the time.
So most of the opposition in the immediate period following the enactment in 1972 was generated through the NCAA, which did not control women's sports at that time. It was another organization. And mostly it's Division I football and basketball teams. And they convinced a number of members of Congress. In the Senate, the lead was Senator John Tower of Texas. In the House, it was Congressman Jim O'Hara, who represented a district in Michigan, which I think at that time included Ann Arbor or Michigan State. I'm not sure which. But the notion was that if you had to provide opportunities in sports for women that were proportional to their being in colleges, you would require so much money. That money would have been generated by investments that schools had made in their football teams and their basketball teams. And therefore, it made sense to these people that those sports, which they called the revenue generators, should be removed from the equation and should not be subject to the reach of Title IX. That was a battle that took place in 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976, 1977. I left the Senate in 1968, but I knew it was still going on. And it went on for a long time after. In addition to all the other things about Title IX, and one of those other things that I want to stress, because my boss stressed it as one of the defining reasons for Title IX, was the fact that it had another component to it. And that component was education itself.
Yes.
That women were being denied access to certain schools. There were quotas in law schools. There were quotas in medical schools. There were no scholarships for women. This was also a reason for Title IX. And Title IX was conceived to address that as much as it was sports. It was designed in the broadest possible way, deliberately, to encompass everything.
And the other thing that's important to think about it in that moment, and then I want to talk about the latest issues, transgender issues and the like. But the other thing that's important in the moment to think about is who the initial beneficiaries actually were. I mean, who benefited, and Sonia, you may want to speak to this. I've got some thoughts on it. Who, I guess the thought is you've got this whole world of women's sports that exist largely with women coaching women, refereeing women, and the like, and then the AIAW was the name of the
Right.
the women's NCAA, I think we might have referred to it as at the time.
Yeah, it was the NCAA brought a lawsuit against Title IX in 1978. And then in 1980, following the famous axiom that if you can't beat them, join them, made a monetary offer and took over basically women's collegiate sports. So their control dates from 1980.
And there are studies and the like of who benefited the most from Title IX in sports, and then there's certainly issues related with affirmative action more broadly. But Sonia, do you have any thoughts on the initial occurrences and who was winning, who was not?
Well, if we're looking back over that period from early 70s through the mid 80s, I think we see gradual expansion of women's sports going forward, but we don't see any major change in terms of what are considered the big sports. That football continued to dominate any college budgets. And how would we then proportion money across all of the sports, right? If ones are considered moneymakers and others aren't. Most recently, during the pandemic, that issue came up at Stanford. And Stanford had announced it was going to close down at least 11 or 12 sports,
Right.
In part because they were not revenue generating. Well, I mean, really? And it was the graduates who wrote in and said, look, I played on such and such a team, and if you in this team now, don't ever call me again in life. I mean, there was a real concerted pushback. And
yeah, so there was a lot of the men wrestling team is gone, the men's gymnastics is gone, trying to find this financial balance, which didn't necessarily relate to an opportunity balance, which was really the key focus.
That's exactly right.
Of the law.
Men's wrestling was the most anti equality. They brought a lot
I
of
wonder why,
lawsuits.
Jay. What was the problem? What was their problem? But again, for the purposes of this discussion, and how does it relate to broader issues around equality, whether it's in the sports arena or in on college campuses, we are still fighting those battles, and we should not feel that while some success has been made over the past 50 years. And we had a anniversary recently. Ken and I were talking about, oh, has it really been that long? Yeah, it's been a long time. And now the question is, how do we make sure that we complete that first mission, which was equal treatment under the law for girls and boys playing sports in colleges?
And high schools.
Excuse me?
And high schools.
And high schools. Well, that's why I was kind of keeping it with the girls and the boys instead of the women and the men. But it's still this question of how do we make sure that students get to play, and what restrictions are we putting in their place? And a number of you are aware of the controversy over transgender students in the sports arena. And we have to look at that and not act like this is not an issue, because it's already been weaponized. So for those who don't want to provide equal treatment to people regardless of their orientation or their gender identity. And I would argue that we're at a very special moment where we either pretend like the fight is over and we give up, or we redouble our efforts to make it happen. And I'm coming back to a question in the chat from one of my dear friends who asked me what helped me keep determined to fight for basketball for women back in the 70s. Well, again, it was wanting to play personally. And then when my teammates elected me captain, I was like, well, I guess I need to say something. That was also part of it. But I will also admit that when we finally were able to engage in dialogue, the school was receptive. And I would argue that's one of the reasons why Stanford to this day stands out in terms of its athletic department and opportunities for students regardless of gender. That was not true in 1970 or 72, and barely true as of 1980. But since that time, I in terms of my alma mater, I'm willing to acknowledge that change did come about in a positive way. Was it even across the board? No, certain sports were still favored over others. We know the football guys, and I'm sorry, Kenny, I can't leave that alone. They take up all the oxygen, and the rest of us have to push for continued support and acceptance, but it isn't as bad as it was 50 years ago. So
I'm reformed though, my son played tennis, so I'm reformed and all that.
And Diane, again, back to your point earlier, I thought Diane was the first. I didn't think it was me. And I kept saying, no, you got to talk to her. And she's like, no, it wasn't me. It wasn't me.
It was you. It's you.
But it was part of my upbringing to try and right something if you think it's wrong. And that's the shortest answer I can give to Stephanie's question to me.
And Dean Aries raised a great question related to this. I think a good place to kind of tie some stuff up is, and Jay said this during his initial comments. Title IX wasn't designed for sports. I mean, that's not what was supposed to be going on. And then Jay gave a great explanation about how that kind of evolved. And I think even today, the factors that Jay pointed out about educational opportunities, professional opportunities that weren't occurring, Title IX is just not referenced enough in that regard as an applicable path to make the change that needs to be made. We've seen it much more in sexual harassment, discrimination, those kinds of activities, but not so much in kind of the job marketplace, administrative spaces within the academy, which is just it's an incredible 37-word tool that's still underutilized and not only in some ways, minoritized into sport where it should be utilized much more broadly. I don't know if that resonates at all.
I think it does. I think it does on a number of levels, but particularly asking the question of what's next and how do we learn from our Title IX experience as we're looking at the Equal Rights Amendment, as we're looking at the possibility of Roe versus Wade being overturned. I mean, there's so many different moving parts in this space right now, and we're waiting to see what the Supreme Court's going to do. I'm not sanguine about that. I think it's going to be a very, very difficult period for women's rights in general. But I think we do have an opportunity as a nation to express our feelings and our support for various policies, whether it's Title IX or the Equal Rights Amendment. And if we don't do that, then we're left with a system that would predate 1970. That's where I'd start.
There's a great article that I've actually got to step off, and I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany to kind of continue to guide the conversation and go get into your questions. But there's a great article by Alfred Matthewson. I forget the first part of it, but the after the colon, it's and the function at the junction, and it looks at, as I was raising, that impact of Title IX, the winners and the losers initially, and it's before the word intersectionality was happening that he talked about. Don't just look at the women that get the jobs, look to see if there's any Black women getting the jobs as head coaches and the like. But ironically, the big winners were men, because this opened up a whole new market for coaching, and men saw this market, and there were men that were coaches already, and they said, let's go get those jobs. And we see, many of the vestiges of that. That's one of the things that has changed, that kind of quietly people have watched as it's happened. But this it's kind of the unintended consequences of laws. That was one of them that article by Matthewson highlights that I always think about. But I appreciate this opportunity to continue the conversation, and I am.
Well, I still think that men probably represent the majority of coaches of women's teams.
Yeah.
And it wasn't supposed to be like that, Jay.
That's right.
All right. So now we move on
Thank
to
you.
Tiffany.
Yeah, well, one question that someone just wanted to clarify is to expand on that, and how does Title IX apply past just the student athlete role? What about the head coaches and leadership for sports programs? How is Title IX applied there?
Well, I'll tell you how it was supposed to apply, and then Sonia can tell you how it does work. It was supposed to apply to everything within the educational institution, as long as it received any federal funding for any aspect of its life. So it applied to faculty, it applied to staff, it applied to workers, it applied to students, it applied to coaches. It was a blanket.
So did you see that happening?
Well, how it happened in real life is a very different story, because the progress that has been made in real life has actually come as a result of either specific protests within institutions or
Yes.
lawsuits.
Lawsuits.
Lawsuits have been the kind of defining characteristic. And I know that because the late Senator Bayh was filed a lot of briefs about how Title IX was supposed to apply to things, including one very famous one called Jackson versus the Birmingham School of Board of Education, in which a coach got fired for trying to apply Title IX. So the extent to which it has been used is really a function, as of Sonia pointed out, people willing to use it. The struggle is ongoing. It's not like, oh, we've reached the milestone, we've achieved this, we've achieved that. It's every day, every single day.
And I would follow Jay's point on that, Tiffany, by saying that we did not write equality into the Constitution. And maybe it's time that we finally do that. Could it be through the Equal Rights Amendment as one way of considering how best to do that? Or is it going to take more concerted legislative action at a time when our national politics are frozen? That's what creates the concern and angst about this historical moment. And I don't want to keep harping on that, but I think that's where we are. And if we don't pay attention to that, we could look up and essentially see that all of the gains made around issues of civil rights, whether on the basis of race, ethnicity, or gender, might become a thing of the past, depending on how our current court decides to address the issues that are currently before it.
Yeah, that relates to one of the questions that was submitted by an audience member in advance, asking, do you see Title IX having a similar fate to Roe v. Wade, with its enforcement being left up to the states? And if so, what would that mean for public versus private universities?
Well, anytime you leave it to the states, it's a crapshoot, because we don't know what they're going to do. On the one hand, we're always in favor of state action when it expands rights, but not so much when it's restricting rights. And unfortunately, with respect to women's rights to their personal autonomy, we're seeing more restrictions than expansions of those rights. And that's the concern. How do we address that in a way that allows us to continue to make a more perfect union? That's where I'd start.
I do think that there is a foreboding and sense of jeopardy in regard to legislation like Title IX, as fortunately, in some respects, the Congress is immobilized at the present moment. But we have an election coming up in 2022 that will have an enormous impact on whether, in fact, we continue to move in the opposite direction. And that's, it's a very scary prospect. I mean, Title IX it's hanging out there. I would assume that on a good day, Mitch McConnell, the Prince of Darkness, is thinking about what he can do to change it.
Well, certainly if we passed the ERA and had it finally adopted, that would be one answer.
Well, I'm happy to go there on the ERA. It's also been 50 years. March 22nd was the day that we secured congressional passage. And we did so, and I can tell you this firsthand, we did so believing that we will, within 3 years of getting it ratified, until Phyllis Schlafly entered the equation. And
now
where
we
it
know
is
what
now,
happened.
where it is now is a very debatable issue politically about what
Exactly.
its status is. So
Exactly.
it would take another Zoom to go through that.
We'd have to Zoom that too, but I just wanted to acknowledge Senator Bayh's role in all of this with respect to our discussion, because we used to have bipartisan support on these issues, and we have to ask, why don't we to this day?
Right.
I think it is not healthy for our nation, whether it's on gender rights or any other civil rights, but it means we have to ask these questions in terms of how do we continue to promote the concept of the importance of equality of opportunity, treatment, and laws. And I know I'm a lawyer, I can't help going in that direction, but I've also been in a policy space for the last couple of decades. And as part of that, it's also asking, what can we do as academics, as scholars, as activists to change this dialogue so that we're talking about positive action, not negative action? That's where I would hang my hat.
Well, I would say, as I pointed out, how incredibly unique it was that he left the debate on Title IX and gave it to his friend Ed Brooke, a Republican.
Yes, he did.
That is totally inconceivable today. That's because years ago, Mitch McConnell drew a line in the sand and announced at the Obama inauguration that anything that this administration wanted, they could forget. And that line not only was drawn in the sand in Washington, it now turns out, thanks to Donald Trump, that it was drawn in the sand across America. And so that's why 2022 becomes so incredibly important in the scheme of things. And if women don't mobilize and get out and vote based on what appears to be a very bad decision, draft decision from Justice Alito, I don't know what will. I honestly don't. And in particular, it becomes even more critical if you look at the history of off-year elections.
Yes.
They tend to not be good for incumbents, and that automatically is a strike against Democrats. So it will take an extra effort just to preserve what we have.
And Tiffany,
Sad.
it is. Tiffany, did we have any questions we haven't addressed yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
One more person asked, how do we do at CUNY in terms of how we apply and enforce Title IX? Are we in a culture of compliance, or do we have an opportunity to do more?
Well, there's always room to do more, right?
How do we do more?
That's right. Well, I think we do more by shining a light on situations where we think maybe we haven't met our responsibility of having equal treatment or equal opportunity based on gender or any other type of gender identification. And I think it is a good area for us to address with our diversity experts on campus, But beyond that, I think it's up to us as teachers to talk about these issues in our classes so that students have a sense of this is what you can do if you feel that this particular policy is not doing enough internal to CUNY, right? Let's get our house in order. And when it's in order, we can then address what's happening outside in other places. I'd start there.
Thank you.
Can I just give you, I want to sum up in a way with a sports metaphor, because I think
Sure.
that's all we've really been addressing here.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to take the liberty of giving you my starting 5 all-time first team Title IX.
Great.
Bunny Sandler, the godmother of Title IX. It
True.
all started with her. Edith Green, who gave her Bunny Sandler the opportunity to make it into public policy. Patsy Mink, who for decades after passage led congressional efforts to fight limiting Title IX.
Yep.
Billie Jean King,
My
her-
hero.
her tireless efforts and for demonstrating at the most timely point, just when Title IX was coming into existence, what it meant to be a woman athlete. And Birch Bayh, who authored those 37 words. That's my all-time All-American Title IX team.
That's pretty good. I like it too.
That's good.
Yay. So did we miss
I'm
any
looking at the
questions?
chat. Yeah, let
Yeah,
us
we
know if
got-
you have other questions.
There's lots in here. I just wanted to make
Sonia,
sure.
do you have any advice for us, given your experience kind of pushing for this enforcement at Stanford and recommendations for other people who
Sure.
run into?
Well, I think it starts with identifying who can make the decision for change. And from there, working in concert with different folks to say, this is important and this is why. So it's having opportunities like this Marxe talk and the other activities around campus where we can shine a brighter light on the topic. But more importantly, it's the follow-up. Let's not just have something that looks great on paper if we don't adopt it as a viable, workable policy. So I would say that we, drive people like Dean Aries and others crazy by constantly giving them things that we want them to do. And if we don't have the money for it, well, then let's raise it. If we haven't made the argument well enough, well, let's make it. I mean, what does that take in terms of encouraging those most affected by the policies we're talking about to understand they have a role as well? It's not just enough for those in a position of having a platform to make the case. It's also, what are you prepared to support and what are you prepared as a student or activist to do for that next step? It's not just a one-off. Oh, I don't like this, but I can't do anything about it. Well, if you do nothing, you're right. But if you do something and show that this is an issue that's of importance to you, then we would hope that the administration would be responsive to at least have dialogue to see what happens next.
Right.
See, that's the policy part of me.
Yeah.
Otherwise, just sue them. Just sue them. But no, we don't say that in the policy space
Yeah.
because that's a little too limited. And even if you sue, if you don't have widespread support, it doesn't mean you're ultimately going to be successful either.
Thank you. Jay, you had wanted to talk about the enforcement after it was passed and how difficult it was to enforce. And have you seen that change over time in the way it's been applied and the focus over the last 50 years?
Absolutely. It is almost 100% a function of who the president appoints to be the Secretary of Education and how it is administered. And we have gone through different waves. Going back to 2003, when President Bush convened a commission, which was so inaptly named, a commission on equal opportunity in education or something, under Secretary Rod Page, the Secretary of Education. It was actually designed to try to get some of the NCAA objections made into policy. And it was only because two women, Donna De Verona and what's her name, Foudy, the soccer player, went to Senator Bayh and said, we want to file a minority report, and we want you to tell us what you thought Title IX was supposed to be in relationship to this. And they did. And that threat eventually led Secretary Page and the president to withdraw most of those recommendations. Then we had a different set of circumstances. We had better enforcement under President Clinton. We had great enforcement under President Obama. We had a Dear Colleague letter go out to everyone. And then all of a sudden, we had another reversal. We had Betsy DeVos, at the direction of the administration, go in and change the rules about how Title IX sexual harassment procedures were supposed to operate, being much more restricted. So it is a direct function of a political decision that's taken, who the president appoints to be the Secretary of Education. There's no room for anything else in that process.
Interesting.
Another point we can think about with respect to Title IX, Tiffany, is that when we say Title IX, the first thing that comes to people's minds is sports. And it wasn't intended that way. When you look at the actual language, neither sports or athletics are even mentioned, right? And so the people, including Jay, that put this together were focused really on what was happening to women who were being denied admission to graduate professional schools like Marxe. Hello. And yet somehow it got turned into just about sports, even though we're now seeing a broader interpretation as we're looking at issues involving sexual assault on campuses, sex discrimination and other ways as well. So because of that language, it can be an expansive approach, but it can also be a narrow one. And I think that's part of the purpose behind us wanting to talk about this in this forum, to start thinking more seriously about how do we make sure that women within the academic space are being treated as fairly as they deserve to be. And that's not sports. That's something on a different level.
Do you want to say more about how Title IX works with ongoing issues of sexual harassment and sexual violence on campus?
Well, what I would say is that we're still trying to figure that out. That one of the changes Jay was mentioning was in the last administration, a total rewriting of the language concerning sexual assault. And now students feeling that if I raise a concern, I will be, some kind of letter will be on my head because I did that. And was there a process that allows for resolution of those issues short of court? Those were some of the issues that have arisen. And I don't think those earlier, the change in language was particularly helpful. I'm trying to be very, very politic today. But at the same time, it raises that question of how do we protect students when they are away from home and vulnerable? And there should be a process. We've seen some schools that are doing better than others, and maybe that becomes a way of sharing that information. Hey, look what they did here. There was a resolution. They're moving forward and not moving backwards. But
thank you.
Clearly a big issue. And as you know, it was also a big one at Stanford for a number of different reasons.
Right, right.
It goes back to the fact that we took great pains in drafting the language in such a way that it was supposed to be all encompassing. And the fact that over the years, its interpretation and relevance has been either expanded or narrowed has really been a function of what people want to make of it. It became about sports because the NCAA made it about sports because they wanted to get rid of it. That's why,
Yes.
that's why sports became the focal point. As Sonia said, my boss's view was that it was a first step to dealing with what the Equal Rights Amendment was supposed to deal with, that education was the most important pathway to women getting good jobs and having financial security. Why were women being discriminated against in the workforce? That goes back to the fact that they were being discriminated against in academia. There were quotas in schools. You couldn't get into medical school. You couldn't get into law school. There was no way you could do engineering. Women were just not fit for engineering. So this was
Well, they were, Jay. They just weren't allowed.
exactly. Well,
Okay.
I said it sarcastically. Yes, that's been proven. Yes, they are.
Absolutely.
Thank you. One a question that someone has brought up is what arguments, if any, have arisen regarding selective service for individuals assigned male at birth who now identify as female from their adult years? How is this being addressed?
It's
Title
being
IX
well,
application.
it was addressed very briefly in the end of the end of 2021 when the Congress made an effort to change the selective service law.
Yes.
And for some people wanted to add women into the obligatory having to register
Yes.
for the draft. That effort never happened. But I will read you. Let's see where I have it. There are specific rules about how you deal with people who were at birth described as either male or female. You can go online and look at this. There is a whole set of rules. Here it is. If you're an individual who was assigned male at birth, that's what you chose, you are required to register with a selective service within a certain period of time after your 18th birthday. And that includes people who have transitioned before that or after that. So that is what it currently is. If in fact, in future Congresses, they go forward and do prescribe that women are required to register for the draft regardless, this will again be brought up and be a part of that dialogue.
And the reason that's so important, Jay, is that issue of mandatory service for females was one of the reasons that there was such a pushback against the Equal Rights Amendment.
Right. Yes.
Remember, that was another one of those factors, right?
It was part of the dialogue. Yes.
The other part of the dialogue was, oh, this will lead to same-sex marriages.
Right.
That was also part of the dialogue, right?
Yes.
And so we're seeing these cultural issues continue to be played out. And it is up to the American people to show, well, what are you willing to support? Whether it's on your individual state level or in terms of a constitutional amendment, as we were talking about with respect to the ERA.
Well, in regard to ERA itself, it definitely exists actually on both levels.
Yeah.
Because there are, I don't recall right now what the numbers, but well into the 20s, states that have state equal rights amendments within their own constitutions, regardless of what the status is at the federal level, which now is a state of suspended animation. No one can tell you with certainty what state we're actually in. Does it exist? How many states have actually ratified it? Is it open to ratification further? Does it have to go back as Justice Ginsburg had proposed a long time ago, de novo, to starting again? Well, the prospect of getting 2/3 of the Senate to
It's not
agree
gonna
to
happen.
anything and
Not gonna
3/4 of the states is a non-starter. It's a non-starter. So yes, these are all issues that have resurfaced in the context of today. They were the issues that defined the debate on ERA in the 1970s.
Okay, one more question from the chat is, how do you view the Department of Education's current role in providing updated Title IX guidance, especially since the Trump and DeVos leadership? What change is needed on this front now? Do you have any recommendations for them?
Well, I would say, from what little I know, the reporting system is horrible.
Yes, I would agree with that.
It is very, very difficult to make an assessment of how the process is being worked out individually, because each school is reporting according to its own wants and needs. And there just has to be a more coherent, unified system. And we don't have that. And in fact, we took a step back from that under Secretary DeVos.
I think we can also look at how issues over sexual misconduct have created a little cottage industry for lawsuits. And I say that as a lawyer, not because I'm trying to be snarky. But if rules aren't clear, it means that you're turning to the lawyers to help resolve what policy ultimately ends up being adopted at various educational institutions. So how do we do this in a way that allows us to move forward when there are so many other urgent things on our national agenda right now? I say that we try and show some leadership here at Marxe, but also beyond Marxe, to say these are important issues, and let's discuss, let's debate, let's resolve, and let's pass some new legislation if we need to. But see, I'm a policy person today. I put my lawyer hat someplace else.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, that's the end of our questions. So, but if you have any final words or things we haven't gotten to yet, we're interested.
Well,
My
I really
suggestion would be maybe we do one in the fall on the Equal Rights Amendment.
Ooh, that's a great idea.
okay, Jay. So I know what I'll be working on over the summer, but I did want to acknowledge the chat we received from Mrs. Bayh. Let's see if I can pull that back up.
I have it.
You have it?
Yeah, first of all, yeah, I was going to close with that. Jay and Sonia, I want to thank you so much for this. And Catherine Bayh, I think you've summed this up so well. I'm going to read it. Birch studied the career and economic inequalities faced by women and how they could all be traced to the inequality they faced in education, the corrosive and unjustified discrimination against women. And I'm listening to the discussion today and realizing we focused a great deal on sports and how much broader this issue is, and how critical it is to keep that focus, both that it's not just on sports, it's in all areas in which, the sphere in which women exist, and the impact, the effort to protect and ensure women's rights in what they do with their lives, and in terms of their education, the work opportunities that are open to them. So yes, there's absolutely the need for more discussion. Jay, Sonia, Tiffany, thank you so much. And to Kenneth Shropshire, who's now not here. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was certainly my pleasure. Thank
Go
you.
Baruch.
And we will, this